So welcome to this 7 Insider event, the first of our post-summer events in 2023. It's a pleasure to have Sean Gallagher with us to talk about covering the climate crisis, and especially covering it from his base as a freelancer in Beijing in China. Sean, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me, David.
So just to start with, you have a background in the sciences, which I think came before your interest in photography. Tell us a little bit about your educational background and then how you transitioned into photography, video, and visual reporting.
Sure. Well, I grew up in the north of England, actually not too far away from where you are now. I grew up just outside of Manchester in the kind of the rolling green countryside of northern England. And when I was at school, I was particularly interested in geography, especially the physical sciences. I had a bit of a fascination with things like volcanoes and glaciers and everything to do with physical geography. But I was also really interested in nature and the biological sciences. So when it came to choosing what I wanted to do at university, I actually just followed my passion and interest, really, which was mainly the biological sciences. And I came across this subject called zoology, which is a branch of biology which looks at everything to do with animals, whether it's animal ecology, animal biology, ecosystems, these type of subjects. And just the idea of that really fascinated me because, I was a big fan of people like David Attenborough and Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter, all these people who are really fascinated with nature and the environmental sciences. So I knew that was something I would like to get into. So I decided to go to university and study that. And I studied for 3 years at Newcastle University, which is coincidentally where you are now.
Yes.
So I spent 3 years there studying zoology. But it was actually during my time at university that I kind of stumbled across photography. I was at home or visiting my parents one summer, and I came across my mother's old film camera, an old Canon film camera, just tucked away in a shoebox somewhere. We were moving things around, and I discovered it. And I asked her if I could use it, and I started playing around with it, took it back to university with me. And that's really where my obsession with photography started. And I started taking pictures. I started developing my own black and white photos. I converted my younger brother's bedroom into a dark room when he was away at university as well, and started to teach myself photography. And then after I graduated, I moved back home. I took a couple of part-time jobs and was trying to think about what I really wanted to do with my career. I had this zoology degree. I had this beginnings of a passion of photography, but I didn't really think about it as a career. And after that, I actually managed to land an internship at Magnum in their London office, because I had this idea of photography, but I really didn't know anything about photography. I kind of got interested in photojournalism, and I come across some photographers' work, and I'd done a little bit of research online and found out about these photojournalism agencies. And one of them I found out was called Magnum. It was in London. So I picked up the phone and I called them and I said, "Hi, I'm interested in photography. Do you have any opportunities for young photographers?" Which, looking back on it, knowing now about agencies like Magnum and Seven, you don't just pick up the phone and call them. But I didn't know any better at that time. And luckily, when I called them, another intern had just cancelled their internship.
Right.
And they said, this was on like a Friday afternoon, and they said, can you come down to the offices and start on Monday morning? So I, again, naively said yes. And I jumped on the train and I slept on my friend's couch in London for a month. And for that 1 month, I was the errand boy in the office, filing slides, returning prints into the right boxes, because no one was really using digital around 2003, 2004. It was in the very early stages.
Yes.
But from that month internship, they invited me to come back for a year-long internship. So that was a kind of it was a paid position, but a pretty basic pay for London. But it got me into the business, so to speak, really. Fantastic. And that year in the office was my photography education, really. Right. I'd already been teaching myself photography for myself, but having that year looking at the work of those photographers at Magnum, and then learning about agencies like Seven and Panos and the work of other National Geographic photographers, that really just opened my eyes to photojournalism, to the power of photojournalism, of the potential that photography had for communicating stories about the world. And so I already had that interest in environmental issues from my studies. And by the end of that internship, I was like, I know what I want to do.
Yeah.
I want to become a photojournalist, and I want to focus on environmental issues. Because at that time, I knew
those two things really combine very clearly at that point. That you had that interest in photography, you were having that experience at Magnum and so on, and you were immediately connecting it to your science background and thinking about environmental issues. That was the driving force.
Yeah, very early on, that idea really took hold in my mind. I didn't know if it was possible,
right?
But I thought at that time, again around 2003, 2004, I was thinking, okay, well, how am I going to make a bit of a name for myself in photography and photojournalism? And some of the people who I worked with at Magnum, they said, they wanted to give me advice to help our careers get started, me and the other interns, and they said, well, you've got to pick your niche. You've got to maybe pick a place in the world, or maybe you have to pick a certain type of issue that you cover, or maybe you have a really unique style of photography. That needs to be the thing that you focus on, the niche that kind of you can pin yourself to. So I thought to myself, well, I love learning about environmental issues, and I love learning about nature, and starting to think about climate change at that time. It's something that I'd been studying on the degree, and I'd started to read more about it, but nobody was talking about it in the media, certainly. And no one really in photojournalism was doing it specifically about these type of issues. So I thought, well, maybe that's a little window for me. Maybe I could make a little niche for myself covering environmental issues. So that idea formed fairly early on. But again, I was young right at the beginning, and I didn't even know if it was possible.
What was the first, so post that experience at Magnum, you do a year there, what was the first environmental story you did that got published, and how did it come about?
Yeah, the first one that I did, the first major story that I did, was about desertification in China.
Right.
So at the end of the internship, we were giving a little grant, which was just enough to basically buy us a plane ticket to wherever we wanted to go. And that was to help us kickstart our career. And I'd gone back home at that time. And my father was quite an extensive traveler. And he'd always come back home with lots of stories about the places that he'd been. And the one place that was his favorite out of all the places that he'd been to was China. He always loved traveling to China, and that enthusiasm kind of rubbed off on me. And so after the internship, I literally sat down with a map, and I thought, okay, where shall I go to try and, kickstart my career?
Yeah.
And China just jumped off the map at me. And I thought, the Olympics are coming. It was a couple of years out from the Summer Olympics.
Right.
And I thought, people are going to be interested in stories from China.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe if I go there and just be there and start doing a couple of stories, people will, I might start to get some work from that. And so that's basically what I did. I bought a plane ticket and came to China and started to work on little stories in and around Beijing. And then I had an opportunity to go out to some of the desert areas, which are not too far away from Beijing. And I'd been reading about these stories already. For some reason, I had this idea of desertification. I'd read one particular book about environmental problems in China, and they talked about these huge sandstorms engulfing cities, of towns being taken over by sand dunes, of people fleeing because of the expanding deserts. And for me, as a visual person, as a photographer, the ideas, the potential photographs and stories that could come out of that were it was too good not to at least go and have a look, go and have a try. So again, I just bought a plane ticket and went to one of the places in northern China that was being affected at that time. It's still being affected. And started to take pictures just for myself. Again, it wasn't an assignment. It was just it was just for me, because I was just naturally curious about this issue of desertification. And I know it's a pretty strange issue to be interested in, but I believe you have to go after what you're genuinely interested in. And from that story, from that trip, I used those images to pitch a bigger project about desertification to the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting.
Yes.
And that was in 2009. And I got a grant from the Pulitzer Center, which allowed me then to do a much more expansive project about desertification. And that trip was almost 6 weeks, traveling from one side of China to the other, starting in Beijing, going overland all the way to the western border regions, and stopping at 5 or 6 places along the way, doing a little story in each stop, but telling a much broader and much bigger picture about the various challenges about desertification. And that story was ultimately published with the New York Times, and National Geographic China did a really nice spread in the magazine here. And that was really the beginning for me.
So basically your hunch of going, basing yourself there, doing stories that you had the background to cover and were interested in, paid off in the end.
Yeah, but at the beginning it was a real gamble. But I suppose I had the advantage at that time in my life. I didn't have any commitments. I didn't have family. I didn't have anything holding me down in the UK. I was in my mid-20s, so I had a lot of freedom. But I knew that I had freedom, and I knew that was the time to try it and to give it a go, to give being a photographer, a professional photographer, to give it a go and to see if it would work. And I think you have to realize at what place you are in life and what opportunities are open to you and that are not at any particular time. But at that time, I thought it was a gamble. But I think nearly 20 years later, I'm actually coming up to 17 years living in China. I think the hunch paid off, because really the two biggest stories in the world at the moment, I feel, I am slightly biased, but I feel are stories surrounding the climate crisis and China. Those are the two huge issues affecting our world at the moment.
So Sean, you're going to share with us some of your visual stories, the work that you've done. So why don't you go to that presentation and talk us through some of those images. While you're setting that up, just a reminder to folks in the audience, if you want to ask questions, please drop them into the Q&A box, not the chat, the Q&A box. I'll keep an eye on the Q&A box, and I'll ask those things of Sean as we go along, or we'll cover them at the end. So Sean, if you share your screen.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I just wanted to give people a little bit of an introduction to some of my work, some of the stories that I've been covering over the past 17 years here in Asia. Day to day, I'm covering stories as a freelance photographer, working for various publications such as National Geographic and The Guardian. But most of my work really focuses on environmental issues. As David mentioned, and we talked about, I'm based here in Beijing, and I've traveled all over China over the years covering stories. But I've also used Beijing as a base to travel to other countries in the region, really because it's not, the story of the climate crisis isn't just about one country. Of course, China is incredibly important. It's central to what's happening with regards to the climate. But after a few years of working on stories in China, I really realized that I needed to get outside of China as well, to look at what was happening in other countries, China's neighbors, how they were tackling climate change, how they were dealing with environmental issues, perhaps different environmental issues or similar ones, and trying to understand that China obviously doesn't exist in a bubble, and that especially with environmental issues, borders don't really make any difference. So understanding what's happening in the region as a whole was really important in terms of informing my coverage of issues in China, but then also informing my coverage of issues in other countries as well. So here, these images, these first images are all from China, just looking at some of the different stories that I've covered, like the story about desertification that I mentioned before to you, David, looking at other stories about biodiversity, about how biodiversity loss is an incredible problem at the moment all around the world. You've probably heard about the extinction crisis that we're also experiencing at the moment. Looking at issues like climate change on the Tibetan Plateau, which is in the west of China, and temperatures are rising there faster than anywhere else outside of the poles. So I've been there many times. It's an amazing region, beautiful landscapes, incredible people, but everything is changing there because of climate. And if you see this slide, this is a story I did about 5 years ago, looking at the rise of exotic pets in China, how the wealthy, affluent middle classes are buying these strange and exotic pets, and looking at how that ties into the topic of biodiversity loss. So again, this is using photography in different ways, really. Sometimes I've gone through slightly different stages throughout my career in terms of what I like to photograph. I've gone through my portraiture kind of phase, and at the moment I use drones a lot through my work, but the underlying theme is always about the environment. So with each story, I'm trying to think of different ways in which I can tell that story. I'm trying not to get too stuck on maybe more of a classic photojournalism approach, or portraiture, or using drones, or also using video, which I do a lot these days as well. I do a lot of short form documentary filmmaking. So I'm thinking about the story that I want to cover, the issue that I want to look at, and then think about the best tools and best ways in which I can tell that story. And that might be still images in the more classic reportage style, or it might be portraiture, or it might be using a newer technology like the drones. So it doesn't matter to me, really. I don't worry about that too much. The main point for me is to find the best way in which I can tell the story. And so from these images, you can see that these stories, like the one that you just saw from Tuvalu, was in 2019. Cambodia was just before the pandemic, before the world went into lockdown. I was able to do this story about how Cambodia is being affected by forest fires and deforestation. So you can see some of these images are taken with standard, normal, if you like, camera. Others are taken with a drone. But when I'm presenting them, I'm combining them in the presentation together to give this, I think, a more rounded view of the stories that I cover. And I think doing this for these environmental stories, using the drone, for example, is really very, very useful. And in certain situations, I'm able to take pictures that I would never have been able to take, like this image on screen now of a logging yard in Cambodia, which is in the middle of a protected sanctuary. And we got chased away by the heavies, by the thugs, when they noticed that the drone was flying overhead and we were taking these pictures. But it really added something very, very unique and special for that particular story.
So for those drone images, the drone is shooting video and then you're taking a screen grab from the 4K video or the high-res video from the drone?
No, I'm flipping between video and photos, actually, when I'm flying the drone.
Right.
So in that particular situation, before I fly the drone, I'm thinking, okay, what's the priority here?
Yeah.
Do I want stills from this situation or do I want video? So then once the drone's in flight, you can switch pretty easily between the two,
right.
Depending on, what the situation is in front of you. These images on screen also are taken with drone, of course, on a little series I did about the effects of flooding in the Mekong River, again in Cambodia. And again, it's trying to use the drone, use the technology to just give a literal different viewpoint,
yes.
but also just trying to think about this issue in a slightly different way. This series was just photographing fallen trees in the river from above, and it's a series of about maybe 15, just over 15 images from that series. So it just gives you a different way of looking and thinking about this story and about these issues in places like Cambodia.
Yeah, I mean, the scale and the perspective that it offers is quite extraordinary.
Exactly. And I found that quite exciting when the technology started to get good enough that you could use the photos and the video professionally.
Yeah.
And so, for example, like on screen now is a short film I made from Cambodia called Cambodia Burning, which I shot entirely with the drone.
Yeah.
But with this, I wanted to do something a little bit different. And again, this is getting on to some of the things that we're going to talk about thinking about how we communicate the climate crisis. For this particular story, for this film, I worked with a Cambodian poet,
right,
who actually scripted these lines. They came up with a poem based upon the visuals that I gave to them.
Wow.
And then combining this with music, with the poetry and the drone videography, we were able to create this really, really nice, really emotional film that speaks about deforestation, but it's not a typical news video. It's not like something you would see on the BBC or CNN. It's something a little bit more poetic, and it speaks to people about these issues in a very different way. But I think that's really, really interesting, and it's quite exciting. But you're still using the ideas of photojournalism and telling it from a news perspective, but you're also doing something quite different in terms of the way that you're presenting it to the audience.
And was that film commissioned by someone to be a poetic film, or was this a project that you undertook yourself? How did that one come about?
That one was actually also a project that was supported by the Pulitzer Center.
Right.
So, sorry.
I was just going to say, and tell us a little bit about then how did they use that project? Where did they publish it? And do you have a sense about how viewers, audience reacted to it being slightly different as a more poetic way of telling the story?
Sure. Well, the main project was published in photographs online, actually. We had a couple of publications, one with Yale Environment 360. National Geographic ran a lot of the images as part of one of their stories about Cambodia. But the video itself, the film itself, was something that I kind of did in addition to the photos.
Right.
So I had this idea of the film, but it kind of only existed in my mind, and it was a bit tricky to kind of pitch to people that I wanted to make a film using drone video and adding it to Cambodian poetry. It wasn't something that I was comfortable pitching to editors, because I didn't think anyone would be kind of interested in kind of commissioning that. So I got the grant and the collaboration with the publications through the pitching the idea about the photographs and the photo story, the classic photo story.
Yeah.
But then afterwards I came back and then I actually put that film together myself, just with the kind of the vision that I had for the film, and then started to show it to people once it was completed.
Right.
And it actually did quite well, really. It screened at a lot of film festivals.
Yep.
And it screened at the DC Environmental Film Festival in Washington, DC in the US, screening in Cambodia, in Southeast Asia as well. And actually, it's probably the project that I've got the most feedback from.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I got into, well, a little bit of problems with in Cambodia after that actually was published. One of the national Cambodian newspapers, which is run by the government, actually published an article after the work came out, criticizing the film, criticizing me, saying that deforestation wasn't as bad as it was being represented, even though it is.
Yes, so self-evidently from the images. Yes.
Yeah, it really made an impact, and especially we were able to get a lot of footage of some of the illegal activities happening in these nature reserves, and nobody had got that footage before. So a lot of local activists in Cambodia and Southeast Asia picked up on the film. Right. It was shared really well on social media, and was it was received very, very well. And it's probably my most successful project to date. But that, I think, comes from the fact that I tried to do something different. If the project just existed as a photo essay, it would have been fine, but it would never have had the reach and the impact that that film and the general project afterwards did. And so for that reason, I'm really pleased with how the project came out. And I'm glad, again, that I took the risk of trying to do something a little bit different.
Yeah. I mean, do you draw lessons from that about how you tell stories from now on, that actually there is a need, even an imperative, to be different and creative like that to have that impact? Or do you feel that that was a one-off experience that certain things made possible but may not be replicable?
Well, I think it's important that we try to do things differently in terms of the way that we cover issues connected to climate change. I mean, I think for that particular project, yes, I think it will exist on its own. I'm not going to replicate. I'm not going to go to a different country and do another drone video-led film with local poetry. I think that would obviously be just not sensible thing to do, because it needs to exist on its own. And I certainly don't want to repeat the way that I've made something before. However, I do want to, again, going back to what I mentioned before, is find the best way to tell the particular story that you're working on. And for us as photographers and photojournalists, find the best visual way to tell that story.
Yeah.
I think it's a challenge. You don't want to try to do something to be gimmicky.
Yeah.
But you do want to try to find a different way to tell these stories. And I think now, especially with the climate crisis, I think it's really important that we try to get beyond some of those stereotypical images that I think we've all seen in terms of the climate crisis coverage, and find ways in which we can really engage our audiences and get them to care about these big issues. Because, and let's face it, an issue like climate change is complicated. It's this big global issue. But I think as visual journalists, we have to find a way that we can break it down for people and help them see it from perhaps from a personal level, from the people that are being affected. I think I found throughout my career so far, the stories where I've really tried hard to tell the issue through the people being affected, those are the ones that most resonate with people. When I'm able to tell, even if it's just an individual, a family, how they're being affected by the environmental issue affecting them, whether that's connected to the climate crisis or pollution, any of these topics. The only real way to get other people, I found, to care about those stories is to tell those stories through other people, through other individuals, communities, families. So if you can do that, then I think you're onto something in terms of getting people to engage and connect with your story.
Yeah. This is probably a good moment, actually. Ted in the audience has asked a question which kind of touches and repeats some of these issues, but it's worth asking and getting your reaction to. He says, do you ever get the feeling that covering the climate crisis is just a repetitive and intellectual exercise with little actual impact? Being in Western Canada, we're currently experiencing devastating wildfires with entire cities being evacuated, extreme heat warnings, extremely poor air quality due to smoke, etc. We're living the effects, yet I don't see the reality of the climate crisis being taken seriously by government and the general public. Behavior hasn't changed, and we carry on sleepwalking. Quite a lot in that, but I mean, you were touching on some of these things about breaking down this idea of the climate crisis into elements that people can engage with. Have you some other examples, some other thoughts on what you need to do or should do in terms of breaking that issue down to make it something that might lead, that where visual stories might lead to more engagement and potentially more change?
Well, for one, I disagree that there has been no change. I think if I look back to when I started covering these issues just over 15 years ago, if you look at the media landscape in terms of people talking about the climate crisis, talking about environmental issues, it's completely different to where it was 15, 20 years ago.
Right.
The news cycle now is full of climate change stories. There's been a lot of criticism that for many years, these weather or extreme weather events weren't being connected to climate change enough. The climate change wasn't being emphasized as the key driver of these extreme weather events. But I do think that is changing, certainly in a lot of Western media outlets. Not all media outlets, of course. Some are better than others. But in terms of the general media coverage, I do think it's much better. And year on year, over the past 15 years, it has become something that people are thinking about. People talk about the climate crisis now. Whether anything is being done or whether you feel that enough action is being taken is a slightly different topic.
Yes.
I mean, I share his frustration.
Yeah.
I try to keep an objective view and an objective approach to how I cover the climate crisis. But personally, I share his frustration that things aren't happening fast enough. Change isn't happening on on a level that we need. And that level is from governments, it's from big businesses, from top-down global approach to changing the way that we live as societies. And that's not really for me to speak to, and I certainly don't have all the answers to that. But I do think that visual storytelling, whether it's photojournalism, whether it's documentary storytelling, has a really important part to play in helping people understand that. And I think it is our responsibility as photographers or documentary filmmakers to think about how we can do our best to help communicate these stories.
Yeah. Yes, I think Ted is getting at that frustration between the urgency of crisis and the seeming normality of everyday life in the face of these catastrophic events, be they fires or floods or other extreme weather events and so on. Sean, I don't know if you were going to show us any more images or whether that was the final one.
Yeah, a few more images.
Okay.
This is a good one to
speaking of catastrophic events. Yes.
Speaking of catastrophic events, I'm based in Beijing, as we mentioned, and we have had a really intense summer. Normally, I'm going off to different places to cover stories about the climate crisis, but we've had a couple of really bad weather events here in Beijing this summer. I mean, the beginning of the summer was incredibly hot. The capital broke through its all-time temperature records. We had consecutive days over 40 degrees C, which was a record for Beijing. Western China just set a new national heat record in Xinjiang province in the west. And then, of course, we had some really terrible floods in Beijing just 3 weeks ago. And so, obviously, with this happening right in my backyard, this was something that I had to cover. So when the floods hit, which they hit on the very last day of July, August 1st and 2nd, I went out after the rains stopped into some of the rural areas just outside of Beijing. And many of those rural areas were absolutely devastated, as you can see from some of these images. The rainfall that we had over those 3 days was the heaviest rainfall that Beijing had experienced since records had began, which was 140 years. So we just had these record temperatures, and now we just had this record rainfall. And this is what the climate scientists have been predicting, is these extreme weather events. So I went out over the series of the week after the rains ended, documenting the aftermath, basically. And again, I took my drone. Many of the roads were very inaccessible here outside of Beijing. So I actually used my bicycle. I'm quite a keen cyclist, and I know a lot of these mountain roads anyway. So I was able to actually navigate my way through some of the roads, through some of the roadblocks, and get to places where I could start to take pictures. And actually, all of these pictures were taken by drone, because I wanted, again, to show the scale of the destruction that was happening. But again, this is just another little chapter in my coverage of environmental issues in China, really. And hopefully these give you a little bit of an idea about the way in which I approach that. And also this slide that you see now, these vertical videos, I share a lot of my projects online on social media, of course, but I like to try to give people a little bit of an insight into how I work, and sharing these online on social media, Western social media, but also Chinese social media. I like to try to put some of my work out on Chinese social media as well. And a lot of these clips right in the aftermath of the floods, when it was a very kind of a quote unquote hot news topic, got a lot of shares, got spread around a lot. And I think it kind of added to the coverage. I'll just play a couple of these here so you can see the type of clips that I'm sharing. This first one, just basic drone footage flying over the damaged areas.
Yep.
Then you have more drone footage, but combining that with still photos to give people an idea about how I make the images. And then the third one, a little bit of a behind the scenes clip, giving people a little bit more of an insight into my journey as I went out there to document some of these stories. So this is something that I typically do with most of my stories these days.
And as you say, you're sharing these on both Western social media like Instagram, as well as Chinese social media, presumably WeChat. Do you notice differences in the way those two audiences react to the images? Are there obvious differences between Western versus Chinese social media audience reactions?
There are some differences. I mean, I have noticed a lot in the past year or two, a lot of I don't know how to put it really. There's just a lot of reaction to anything that's posted about China or climate change. So if I'm posting something on Instagram, for example,
right,
which is a majority Western audience, because you can't use Instagram here in China, and most people can't. It seems that the topics of climate change in China are very emotive for a lot of people.
Right.
Now, of course, you're going to get the bots, and you're going to get the people who are just commenting for reactions. But whenever I post about climate change or China, or especially those two combined, like the story about Beijing's floods that I did recently, it seems to get a lot of attention. And I found a lot of it has been a little bit negative in terms of a lot of, and I'm not sure how much to, take stock of it really. You look at the comments, you're kind of interested to see how people are reacting. But whether it's the algorithms just feeding the content to the people that they know are going to react. So whether they're going to post comments, whether it's climate change denial or whether it's very anti-China kind of sentiment, where you don't really know if those posts are being fed to those type of people. But there's a lot of interest, even from people who have genuine comments, who are, thoughtful and want to, talk about the impacts of climate change, or want to tell me about something that's been happening to them recently. Maybe there's been flooding in their region. People, leave messages just saying, that's happening here as well. That's affecting our community in different ways. And it's really quite encouraging when you get that type of feedback. But there is a mix of different types of feedback. And in the Chinese social media, I haven't been doing it for very long, but some of my clips that I've been sharing recently, especially of the Beijing floods, got shared a lot. And I share mainly through WeChat. I have a channel, which is basically like an Instagram feed, sharing clips, really quite literal clips, really, from the Beijing flood, showing about the damage that occurred. But the audience there seems to be a little bit different in terms of, it was very much, when I posted clips from the floods, it was very much supportive of the people who must have been affected by the floods. There was a lot more sharing. I don't know if that's to do with the platform itself, but I had one clip that was got about 5 million views at one point. So the kind of the range and the reach of the audience on Chinese social media is a little bit stronger, or gets a little bit farther. So there are definite differences, but again, it's whether you need to think about the reaction from the audience online. When I post content, I'm not necessarily thinking about the comments that I'll receive. It's not something that goes through my thought processes before I post a particular piece of content. But it is something that you take into account after you post things.
So we have a couple of questions about working in China and also dealing with governments in China and the region. So Mike Davis asked, have you had to deal with governments that are more restrictive of storytellers? You were, in the Cambodia case, you were giving an example, actually dealing with, I think, unhappy company officials in the logging yard, for example. But what about the government as a whole? And then Jaime is asking, how do you actually manage to work in China as a Western photojournalist? Are you free to travel and work and tell the stories that you want to tell?
Mm-hmm. Well, the worst experience that I've had is, as you mentioned, the one that I did in Cambodia before the pandemic. That was the strongest reaction that I've had from an authority, from a government.
Right.
And it was very surprising. I mean, the coverage of that story I felt was very accurate and very representative of the true situation there. However, in Cambodia, it's not a story that is welcomed, and Cambodia is quite a dangerous place for journalists and for activists who are wanting to tell those stories about what's really happening, especially in those stories connected to something like deforestation, which is a sensitive issue in Cambodia because the government are heavily connected to the logging trade there. So it's a very lucrative trade. So it's not a story that people want told. And I think as a visitor to Cambodia, I was only there for 3 weeks. I think that allowed me to be able to tell that story, because I think if I lived in Cambodia, it would have been quite dangerous for me to tell that particular story. Obviously, the people that I worked with, were very, very sensitive to those things and made sure that I knew about the situation in Cambodia. I mean, I already knew about it before I traveled there, but they made me acutely aware of it. And of course, I had to do things like keep my sources confidential and the people that I worked with confidential. And the fact that I was able to leave the country after I did that story.
Right.
But many of the people that I spent time with, like the activists who helped me gain access to some of those sites that I photographed, they couldn't leave, and they're still there, working on those stories and highlighting those stories. So, I mean, China is a different country, different system, but it has similarities in different ways. I think many people are familiar with the restrictions that the media has here in China. The media is it's all state controlled. But for me, as a photojournalist here, because of the type of stories that I cover, that being environmental stories, a lot of my stories that I've worked on here in China have been very much almost ecosystem based, and it's not those stories haven't been overly critical of specific individuals or specific parts of the government, for example. So perhaps they haven't been perceived as overly critical. Also, I don't exclusively work in China. A lot of my stories are looking at what's happening in other countries as well. So in that respect, I see China as just one part of the wider story that I'm trying to tell in Asia.
Yeah. You've been in Beijing for a long time now, more than a decade. Have you seen changes in the way that have impacted the way that you've been able to work or tell stories in the last few years, the last 10 years?
For me personally, no. But again, I think that's connected more to the type of issues that I cover. I think if you are working on other potentially quote unquote sensitive topics here in China, then I think you'll have more problems. But for my type of stories, I haven't encountered too many problems. Although even with the story that I just covered about the floods in Beijing, I was very aware that in this particular situation, it was a disaster zone in places. So I had to be very sensitive as a as a foreigner turning up in some of these areas,
Yeah.
taking pictures. But a lot of that also comes down to being culturally sensitive, about knowing how people react to outsiders,
Yeah.
and just working within the local culture and how people might react to you being there with a camera. And that, of course, varies from country to country.
Yeah. Thinking about kind of impact and the way of telling stories, there's a question from Manuel Rivera Ortiz, who you will know from his foundation in Arles. And he says they're covering the issue of climate change this summer with an exhibition dealing with the perspective of humanity's interaction with plants. It's called Grow Up. His question is, how do we keep such topics interesting to a public in an exhibition? There's a potential for fatigue at a critical time when we cannot afford collectively to be fatigued. Do you think that people are being fatigued, and how do you think that one might approach the issue of the climate crisis and visualizing it in an exhibition to keep audiences interested?
Well, I think the first point, in terms of fatigue, I think I've seen it most in the form of people complaining about the negativity of stories surrounding the climate crisis, in that all stories told about the climate crisis are negative. Right. And just everyone is bombarded with negative stories, which I think is a fair point. There's a lot of talk these days about solutions journalism, for example, right, where more focus is presented on what is being done about how we can get ourselves out of this situation that we find ourselves in as a global community. And I think that's really important, actually. But I don't think we should go completely to the side where we're just talking about, the future will be rosy. We have all these solutions, technology will save us, etc. We have to be realistic about the situation that we're currently in, and the fact that if governments, big business, like we talked about before, don't change, then we are going to be in some serious trouble. But I do also believe in the idea that we need more positivity. We need more journalism, whether that's in the form of visual journalism or not, that shows us a path towards some positivity. Because I think people need it. People need that positivity. They need an idea about what can be done. So I think it needs to be a balance between the two, between laying out the reality and seriousness of the situation, but also giving people hope, a bit of positivity, and perhaps, and it depends on the goals of the exhibition that Manuel might be talking about. It depends on the goal of the project, whether you are looking to make a change, because sometimes people present stories just to present the story.
Yeah.
But then sometimes people, visual journalists, might have more of an activist kind of approach to their work. So they're really looking to affect change.
Yeah.
You need to think about really what your goal is, whether it's merely to inform people or whether it's to instigate change.
Yeah.
And again, instigating change can differ. Are you trying to change what one community is doing, or are you trying to change what the world is doing? Those are two very different goals. Yeah. So for a local exhibition, for example, you might want to focus on what people can do. You might want to increase the interactivity with the exhibition to engage those viewers. So instead of just walking into a gallery space, okay, here are 50 photos showing you how bad the climate crisis is, and then you leave. What does that do? And I think as visual artists, journalists, whatever you'd like to call yourself, I think we have to think about that. Yeah. When we present our work, whether it's in the form of an exhibition, a photo essay, a short film, what next for the audience after they've looked at that piece of work? And that, what the answer to that what next will differ for every project. But for a local one, I would say the interactivity and, you know, what can local people do to engage with the idea of the climate crisis locally, but then also connecting it to the bigger picture of the global issue.
Yes, and I think the advocates of solutions journalism, I count myself amongst them in terms of, as you say, providing a different part of the picture, not to replace everything. Obviously, it's to provide a more comprehensive picture. Point to the fact that, which is a point you also made earlier, that there has been a lot of change actually over the last 5, 10, 15 years. It's not going fast enough. It's not perhaps generally understood enough, but we are seeing huge changes take place in how we generate electricity in Europe, for example. I mean, coal has disappeared practically as a way in which Britain, for example, generates electricity and has been replaced by substantial growth in renewables. That doesn't mean we need happy stories of wind farms and so on, but it would be nice to see somewhere in the coverage some of these things actually acknowledged and the changes taking place. In the last week, we've seen Ecuador vote to keep fossil fuels in the ground in a popular election
a big story
and referendum, a huge story. So this change is underway. So not only do we need hope for the future, it's also kind of recognizing that change is taking place in the present and has been taking place for some time. I mean, this is not the responsibility of photographers and videographers alone. This is a much broader question, but we kind of fit into that story. Question from Mike, kind of linking to some parts of that. He says that most environmental coverage focuses on the effects, that is the aftermath, such as flooding or fires. That's the standard news approach, inverted commas, he says. So it's easy for climate deniers, to say there isn't a connection between cause and effect. Is there an approach to storytelling that more directly makes the connection if the goal is to get society on the whole to change? There's a big
I guess it depends. It's a tricky one. I guess it depends on the form of storytelling. I mean, can you do that in a photo essay, like in a spread in a typical magazine? Can you do it just with the photographs? That's one of the things that we always grapple with as photographers, as photojournalists, is can you tell that three-part? I always think about it as a three-part: cause, effect, and solutions.
Right.
To the story. Can you tell those three parts? And sometimes there are limitations to just a photo essay, for example. Are documentary films, if you have an hour and a half to 2 hours, can you tell that story better in that form? Can you show people more clearly those links between cause, effect, and solutions?
Yeah.
It's a tricky one to answer, really. But then adding on to that, can you ever really change the minds of those people who have already decided that these things aren't connected, or that climate change is just not true? Although I think that section who don't quote unquote believe in climate change, I think that section of the people who comment on these type of stories, I think their voice is amplified way more than is actual in reality. If you go onto the street and ask people about whether they think the climate crisis is a big issue, I think there's a big disconnect there. But it's a challenge for all visual journalists and journalists in general to be able to make sure we are helping connect those three things: the cause, effect, and solutions.
So we're coming towards the end of our time. We still have time for one or two more questions. If anyone in the audience wants to drop a question into the Q&A box, this is your last chance to get it up. Sean, I've got a question. I wanted to pick also on the idea of fatigue that Manuel was talking about. I mean, I don't personally think that the public as a whole is generally fatigued about any issue, because most people don't watch news and don't spend a lot of time engaging with images. So it would be hard to say they were as a group psychologically fatigued with that. But if there is one group that might be fatigued about things, it could be photo editors. who are
Okay.
important gatekeepers in the process of deciding what gets covered, what gets published, and so on.
Mm. Mm.
Tell us a bit about your experience pitching climate stories to photo editors, and kind of the reactions that you get, and maybe any advice to people who want to pitch stories about some effective strategies in stories to attract the attention of editors. What do you think editors are looking for when people come to them with a climate story?
That's $1 million question.
Yeah, could be, hopefully, yes.
Yeah, it could be, hopefully. Yeah. I think for me personally, I think it's come with the stories that I've had most success getting published are the ones where I've been working with editors for a while.
Right.
Editors who I have a relationship with, who know my work, and who know the type of stories that I can produce and like to produce on any of my reporting trips. So those are the collaborations that I think have been most successful, especially in recent years as more people have become aware of the type of stories that I like to cover and the ways in which I do that. Now, of course, that doesn't help if you're at the beginning of your career, if you don't have those connections. And I don't think there's any real magic answer to that. But I think in terms of the stories, in terms of pitching, again, it connects a little bit to what we were talking about before. Is about trying to humanize these climate stories or these environment stories, and not going too big on them, because some of these issues are very big. They cover multiple countries, different groups of people, and it can get a bit overwhelming. But if you are able to focus your story down to a community, one community that might be being affected, maybe it's I don't know, a community in, I think it was Detroit, wasn't it, in the US, that had a problem with water recently.
In Flint, in Michigan. Yeah.
Flint, Michigan, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
For example, so if I was in that region, you could pitch that you just wanted to do a story about how maybe one street in Flint, Michigan was being affected by this big issue about water quality. But you focus just on one community. So, and I think that's especially true if you are just starting out in photography, or you want to go into photojournalism and you want to work on these type of stories and you have big ideas. But actually, you can find most stories now relatively locally because of the climate crisis, because we're noticing things like wildfires and issues about pollution and climate change, floods. There are stories connected to the climate in particular happening all around us. So I would say try to tell those stories at a local level, but really emphasize that connection to the global story. So you make it really important to the editor that this is a significant issue, a global issue, but you're telling it through a local lens.
Yeah.
And I think that combination works quite well.
Yeah. Yes, and I think that's something that's actually kind of intrinsic to the idea of the climate crisis itself, because there's no actual thing called the climate crisis as a single entity, right? It was what Mike was getting to with the question of cause and effect. The climate crisis is an aggregate of a series of things that we can see traces of, like extreme weather conditions, be it flooding, temperature, or cold. It can be heat and cold. Wildfires, the consequences on biodiversity of all those sorts of things. That's the climate crisis. There's not a separate object out there called the climate crisis that's not these other things. And I think that's the hardest thing to get one's head around and tell the story about, actually. Breaking it down. And once you break it down, then you have to focus on the community, you have to focus on people, and you have to do the research to work out actually how it's impacting on those areas. Because there's also sometimes, perhaps I think, a tendency to go too far the other way and link everything to the climate crisis.
True.
that every refugee who is displaced from somewhere is a climate refugee now, or some claim that would be as absolute as that, which is not the case. So again, we need the research and the evidence for that. Well, Sean, that brings us to the end of our time. I really want to thank you for presenting your work and engaging with us and showing that. I think, you're a quite striking and powerful example of someone who used their background, focused on an area, developed a niche, and has been extremely successful at it. And it's taken a long time, and I'm sure it's had its ups and downs, but where you are now is a very strong place from which to tell some of the most significant stories of our time. So really want to thank you for sharing that with us.
Oh, thank you, David. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And thanks to everyone in the audience for joining as always. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another big social issue. But Sean, thank you. And hopefully you have a restful evening for the rest of the evening in Beijing.
Thanks, David.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.